History Zone, where the past comes alive.
I had trusted the Mississippi River my entire life. By the winter of 1811, I was 32 years old, a flatboat trader hauling cornmeal, furs, and whiskey between the river towns that clung to its muddy banks. The river was a living thing, wide, patient, dangerous, but it obeyed rules. It flowed south, always south. You learned its moods, respected its bends, and if you were careful, it carried you home. That night, December 16th, the river broke every rule it had ever taught me. I was moored just north of the little frontier town of New Madrid in the Missouri Territory. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, the sky clear and sharp with stars. My boat rested easy against the bank, lantern swinging gently as I prepared to sleep. The river whispered its usual low song, and I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. Too peaceful, perhaps, for a land that was still wild and unfinished. I never heard the danger coming. It woke me like a cannon fired beneath my skull. The ground didn't shake at first, it roared. A deep, unholy sound rose from beneath the earth, as if the land itself had cracked open. My boat lurched so violently I was thrown against the railing. Lantern glass shattered. The river erupted into towering waves, slapping the hull like an angry sea. I shouted, though no one could hear me. The shoreline collapsed in front of my eyes. Trees snapped and vanished into the water. Great fissures split the ground, swallowing entire sections of forest. The air filled with the stench of sulfur, choking and bitter, as though hell itself had exhaled. Then, the impossible happened. The Mississippi River began to move north. At first, I thought my senses had failed me. Exhaustion, fear, anything but the truth. But I watched in horror as the current reversed, dragging floating logs, debris, even my own boat upstream. Water surged backward with such force it carved new banks in seconds. The river I trusted had turned against the laws of nature. I fought the ropes, fingers numb and shaking, trying to keep the boat from being torn loose. The water rose fast, too fast, pouring inland, flooding low ground where moments earlier there had been dry earth. Somewhere in the darkness, people were screaming, horses shrieked, dogs howled like they sensed the end of the world. The earth bucked again. I was thrown to my knees as another shock wave split through the land. Sand and water burst upward from the ground in massive fountains, drenching the forest like rain from below. The trees swayed as if drunk, their roots no longer anchored in solid soil. I realized then that this was no ordinary earthquake. This was something far worse. The shaking didn't stop. It came in waves, violent, relentless, each one tearing apart more of the world I knew. The riverbanks collapsed in great slabs, sending walls of earth crashing into the water. The night sky vanished behind clouds of dust so thick they blotted out the stars. I clung to my boat, praying, not for safety, but for survival. I thought of my wife downriver, of the home I might never see again. I thought of how small a man truly is when the land itself decides to rise up. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time meant nothing anymore. When the shaking finally eased, dawn found a world unrecognizable. The Mississippi lay scarred and swollen, its course altered, its banks broken. Entire islands had vanished. New lakes shimmered where forests once stood. The air was silent, not peaceful, but stunned, as if the land was holding its breath. I was alive, but I knew as I stared across the wreckage that the worst was yet to come, because the earth had not finished speaking.
Morning did not bring relief. It brought understanding. When the sun finally climbed over the ruined tree line, it revealed a land that no longer recognized itself. The Mississippi no longer sat where it had the night before. Its banks were jagged and raw, torn open like wounds that had not yet stopped bleeding. Water stood everywhere, ponds where fields once lay, slick mud swallowing fence posts, half-buried cabins leaning at impossible angles. I pulled myself upright on the flatboat, muscles aching as if I had fought a war in my sleep. My hands were blistered from gripping the rail all night. The river was calmer now, but it moved sluggishly, confused, as if it too was unsure which way was south. That was when the ground shuddered again. Not as violent as before, but sharp enough to steal the breath from my lungs. The earth rippled beneath my boots, water trembled, trees creaked and groaned. Somewhere inland, I heard the low thunder of another collapse. This was no single disaster. This was a siege. I knew I couldn't stay on the boat. The ropes that had saved me in the night were now a liability. Another violent shock could drag me under with the hull. I grabbed what little I could, my knife, a wool coat, a flask of river water, and waded toward higher ground, boots sinking deep into the mud with every step. That's when I began to see them. Survivors. Men staggered through the trees, faces gray with shock. Women clutched children wrapped in blankets, their eyes hollow, mouths moving in silent prayer. One man knelt in the mud, clawing at the earth where his cabin had stood, sobbing like a child who'd lost his mother. No one spoke much. We didn't have the words yet. Another tremor struck, stronger this time. The ground split open not 20 yards from where I stood. A crack raced through the soil like lightning, widening until I could see darkness below. A man screamed as the edge crumbled beneath him. We grabbed his arms just in time, hauling him back as the fissure swallowed the place where he'd been standing seconds earlier. That was when panic finally took hold. People ran, without direction, without reason, only away from wherever the ground seemed weakest. Horses broke loose, eyes rolling white, trampling anything in their path. The air filled with dust so thick it turned daylight into twilight. And still, the earth would not rest. By mid-morning, the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with ash and fine soil thrown upward by endless collapses and sand blows. It coated our clothes, our hair, our tongues. Breathing felt like swallowing dirt. Every cough tasted of sulfur and fear. Someone shouted that New Madrid was gone. I didn't believe it until I saw it. By afternoon, I reached what had once been the outskirts of town. Buildings leaned like drunkards. Chimneys lay shattered across the ground. The streets were split and buckled. Some sections dropped lower than others, as if the town had been broken and poorly reassembled. Fires burned where stoves had overturned, their smoke twisting upward into the gray sky. People shouted warnings, hauled water, dragged the injured from collapsed homes. A church bell rang, not in rhythm, but wildly, pulled by someone who didn't know what else to do.
Then the largest aftershock yet struck. The ground rolled beneath us like waves at sea. I fell hard, teeth cracking together. A roar rose from every direction, buildings collapsing, trees snapping, people screaming. The river surged again, though not backward this time, smashing against its banks with renewed fury. When it ended, the bell was silent. Night fell early that day. Dust and smoke choked out the sun long before it set. Fires cast long, trembling shadows across the ruined town. We gathered in the open, afraid of walls, afraid of roofs, afraid of the very ground beneath our feet. No one slept. We waited, because by then, we all understood the truth. The earthquake was not over. It had only just begun.
By the third day, the Mississippi no longer felt like a river. It was a monster. Its waters churned in unnatural directions, swallowing the lowlands we once called home. I watched debris drift past, hulls of flatboats, broken barrels, splintered cabins, things that had been carried south for generations, now floating northward, powerless against the river's fury. Every night, the aftershocks returned, shaking the ground, ripping up trees, toppling what little we had salvaged. We learned to fear the quiet. In the gaps between tremors, the earth seemed to breathe, as if listening for our next move, waiting for its next strike. Men joked nervously about the end of the world, but I didn't laugh. Deep down, I knew it was no joke. The land itself had decided to rise against us. We were a ragged congregation of survivors by then, families huddled together in open clearings, afraid of walls. Horses, too frightened to rest, wandered through mud and wreckage, snorting in panic. The nights were cold. Our breath froze in the air, crystallizing on the edges of coats and hair. Food was scarce. Some had brought along sacks of grain or salted meat, but water was muddy and fish were gone, swallowed or swept away by the violent, receding river. One man, Samuel, claimed he had seen a column of water rise like a wall, moving upstream with such force it ripped trees from their roots. He said it seemed as though the Mississippi had grown a mind of its own, punishing those who dared to live along its banks. I did not doubt him. I had seen enough in the past 48 hours to know the river had become a god, and we were its trembling worshippers. I scavenged what I could. Roof shingles from broken cabins became shields against the rain. Sacks of grain were hoarded like treasure. Every step on the unstable earth carried danger. A crack could swallow you. A fissure could vanish a man before anyone realized what had happened. One morning, as fog hung heavy over the broken town, I wandered toward the river's edge, trying to understand what had become of my world. The sight stopped me cold. In one stretch, the river had reversed so dramatically that I could see the muddy waters flowing uphill for hundreds of yards. Trees, now stripped of bark and branches, leaned at impossible angles, and islands that had once existed were now gone, submerged entirely. I felt an urge to fall to my knees and pray, but there was nothing to pray for. No God had interfered yet. We were all on edge, whispering about omens. Fires burned continuously, not to cook or to stay warm, but to keep some semblance of light in a land that had turned alien. Children cried in their sleep. Mothers clutched them tight, rocking as if their arms alone could hold the world together. Then came the tremor that changed everything. It was not the strongest, not even the longest, but it was precise. The ground beneath me heaved in a rhythmic pulse, cracking a line of earth from one end of town to the other.
I saw the earth lift like a wave, then fall with a roar. Entire families were thrown from makeshift shelters. Horses screamed as if possessed. The river reacted instantly. Water surged, backed up, then rushed over the newly formed banks with indiscriminate fury. I ran blindly toward what I hoped was safety, dragging a child in my arms. Around me, the world was chaos incarnate: splintered wood, overturned carts, screaming animals, shrieking people. In that moment, I felt the raw terror of nature's power, the knowledge that civilization, with all its rules, had been swept aside. By nightfall, exhaustion overtook fear. We huddled together, sharing whispers of hope and despair. No one spoke of returning home. The land was no longer ours. Survival meant walking among ghosts, scavenging amid ruins, and trusting that the next tremor would not be the one to end us all. Somewhere in the dark, I could hear the river whispering again. It had returned to a slower, measured pace, but its voice carried menace. I understood then that the Mississippi had no intention of forgiving us for the arrogance of building along its banks. It had reshaped the world overnight, and we were merely the survivors left to witness the consequences. I sat by the edge of the water and stared at the twisted reflection of the moon, wondering how much longer the earth would tolerate our presence. I wondered if anyone beyond New Madrid would believe the story. I wondered if we ourselves would survive the coming weeks. And yet, despite the horror, I felt something strange, a stubborn thread of determination. If the land had changed, then we must change with it. If the river would not obey, then we must learn to live on its terms. It was a lesson that would cost many of us our sanity, and some our lives.
By the fourth week, the Mississippi had become something I could no longer recognize as a river. It was a highway of mud and water, shifting in ways that defied all reason. Its surface was littered with debris, entire trees, the remnants of cabins, overturned flatboats, all drifting northward, pushed by currents that seemed to mock our attempts at understanding. The people who remained were exhausted, both in body and mind. Each day was a gamble, each step across the churned landscape a potential death sentence. I had found a small clearing near what used to be the main road into New Madrid. It was high ground, just enough to keep the worst of the flooding at bay. Here, a dozen survivors huddled together, sharing the sparse rations we had scavenged. Salted pork, a few handfuls of grain, some dried roots. We stretched each morsel as far as it could go. Every meal reminded us that this land, which we had once thought tame, now ruled us with an iron fist. Sleep was impossible. Every tremor, some small, some enormous, shook our makeshift camp, sending children into wails and adults into silent panic. I would wake in the middle of the night, my hands clenched around a tree root or a piece of splintered wood, listening for the next wave of destruction. Some nights, the Mississippi would groan, a low, unnatural sound that carried for miles, and we would watch as debris floated backward along its surface, wondering what new horrors would appear by morning. One morning, I ventured closer to the river to inspect the damage. The sight froze my blood. A large portion of the bank had collapsed entirely, and the current, still flowing north, had carved deep trenches into the landscape. In one of the trenches, I saw what was left of a neighbor's flatboat. The hull was split in half, barrels of flour floating away like tiny islands. There was no sign of the crew. No one knew if they had been swallowed by the river or thrown into one of the newly formed chasms.
I had seen enough death in the past weeks to know it could be either or both. By now, rumors had begun to spread among the survivors. Some claimed the world had ended, that God had cursed the river and the land around it. Others said the earth was angry, punishing us for our arrogance in building homes and towns along its banks. There were even whispers of strange creatures formed from mud and water wandering in the night. I did not believe them, though deep down, after what I had witnessed, I could not entirely dismiss the possibility. The world had changed, and the boundaries of reality seemed thinner than ever. Food scarcity worsened. We had collected what we could, but the river had claimed many of the stores we had hoped to salvage. Grain sacks had floated away, chickens drowned in floodwater, and livestock scattered or perished. I remember watching a cow struggle against the current one morning, only to be swept away like a toy in the river's relentless flow. Children cried when they saw it, and the adults could offer no comfort. There was none to be had. Survival had become a matter of endurance, not hope. Our mental states frayed alongside the land. Some men sat for hours staring at the river, muttering to themselves. Women whispered prayers into the wind, tears cutting channels through the ash and mud on their faces. I saw a man attempt to dig a grave for his wife, only to have the earth collapse into the trench before he could finish. Grief and fear intertwined, making every day a battle not just against nature, but against our own despair. I clung to small rituals. Each morning, I would check the water levels, marking changes with a stick driven into the mud. I would gather what little food remained, sharing it with those too weak to forage. At night, I would tell stories to the children of a world before the earth shook, before the river turned back on itself, hoping to give them some anchor to the past. Even small acts became acts of defiance against the chaos surrounding us. By the end of that week, I understood something vital. Survival here was not about strength or skill alone. It was about patience, observation, and humility. The river had reversed, the land had cracked open, and we were mere intruders in a place that once seemed ours. To live, we needed to learn the new rhythms of this world. Every tremor, every surge of water, every shift in the mud told a story. Ignoring it meant death. And so we waited. Not with hope, not with courage, but with a stubborn, animal-like determination to survive another day in a land that had forgotten what it meant to be safe.
By the 5th week, the Mississippi had become both enemy and teacher. I had spent days observing it, watching its whims, noting which channels ran faster, where debris gathered, and how the sudden storms changed its mood. We had learned to avoid low-lying banks and treacherous sandbars that had swallowed so many flatboats and supplies. Survival was no longer about brute force. It was about understanding the river's unnatural rhythm. The survivors had begun to organize. We built makeshift barricades from logs and debris, hoping to redirect the water from our camp. It was a feeble effort, but it gave us a sense of control in a world that had stripped us of it. Some men ventured upriver, salvaging what they could from the wreckage, food, tools, and on lucky days, barrels of whiskey to keep morale from collapsing entirely. Every success was small, almost meaningless in the grand chaos, but it kept hope alive. I became something of a guide. My knowledge of the river, once a source of livelihood, now meant life or death for others. I taught them how to read the water, how to spot subtle changes in the current that foretold a surge or collapse. We learned to time our crossings carefully, to use fallen trees as bridges, to cling to sturdy debris when floating across flooded fields. Every day was a gamble. Every step required attention. One false move and you could vanish into the mud or be swept north with the river's unnatural flow. One morning I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A new fissure had opened along the riverbank, wider than anything I had seen before. The water surged violently into it, and for the first time I realized the land itself was changing more rapidly than we could adapt. Entire fields were swallowed overnight. Trees we had used for shelter toppled. The survivors panicked, but I forced calm. "We moved together," I told them. "We survived together." It was not just advice, it was law now. Any wandering alone meant certain death. Food remained our constant challenge. Some days we foraged roots, berries, and what small game we could trap. On lucky days, we found crates of salted pork or flour lodged in the debris of overturned flatboats. I rationed what we had, teaching others to do the same. Greed could kill us faster than the river. I remember arguing with a man who tried to hoard barrels of flour. I didn't yell, there was no energy left for shouting, but I made him understand with my eyes. Hunger is a lesson best learned before it becomes death. By the end of the 5th week, the Mississippi's backward flow had become almost predictable. It slowed during the day, quickened at night, and its direction varied slightly depending on which section you observed. The river had taught us caution, humility, and respect. We could not fight it, we could only adapt. One evening I watched as the sun set across the jagged waters. The orange glow reflected off debris like fire in the water. A man I had guided upriver during the day returned carrying a small crate of fresh fish he had managed to trap in a calm eddy. It was a rare victory. The survivors gathered, sharing the fish, breaking it into small portions. Children ate with trembling hands. Adults ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a treasure. In that moment, I understood the value of small victories. In a land reshaped by catastrophe, even the simplest meal became heroic. Yet despite these small successes, the terror never left. Every night the aftershocks returned, rattling our bones, shaking the trees, and reminding us that survival was temporary. We slept lightly, listening to the river's whispered menace, aware that the next day could undo all our work. I realized that survival was not only about the body, it was about the mind. Fear could paralyze, despair could kill, and madness could creep quietly among the weak. I kept a watchful eye, guiding the frightened, encouraging the hopeless, and maintaining the fragile order that kept us alive. In this new world, leadership was not a choice, it was a responsibility. By the end of the 5th week, we were no longer simply victims. We were students of the Mississippi, learning its strange new lessons, respecting its power, and adapting in ways that our forefathers could never have imagined. It was a brutal, exhausting education, but one that gave us a chance, a sliver of hope that we might see the other side of this catastrophe alive. We had not tamed the river, no one could, but in understanding it, in respecting its whims, we had carved out a fragile pocket of survival in a world that had been utterly transformed. And in that pocket, for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a quiet thought. Perhaps we could endure.
By the 6th week, the Mississippi River had become a living, unpredictable beast. Each day brought new horrors. Aftershocks still shook the ground without warning. Fissures opened suddenly, swallowing everything in their path. And the backward flowing river was a constant, haunting reminder that the world we had known was gone. The survivors were frayed, their minds stretched thin.
Fear was no longer just an emotion, it was a shadow that followed every step. I watched men muttering to themselves, tracing invisible lines in the mud, convinced that the river was speaking directly to them. Women shushed their children for hours, afraid that even the sound of laughter might provoke the earth's wrath. Sleep became a luxury none could afford. We rested only enough to keep from collapsing, eyes flicking to the trembling ground every few seconds, ears straining for the groan of shifting earth. One afternoon, while scavenging along a partially submerged field, I saw something that nearly broke me. A man, older, frail, and nearly blind, was standing at the edge of a fissure that had opened overnight. He seemed frozen in place, staring into the yawning gap in the earth. I shouted for him to move, but he did not respond. Another tremor struck, and the ground beneath him crumbled. My heart stopped. I lunged forward, grabbing his coat just in time. Mud slid under our feet, and we fell to the ground, inches from a death that would have been instantaneous. We lay there for a moment, gasping in the mud. I held him tight, trying to reassure both him and myself that we could survive this. The river doesn't choose yet, we do. I realized then that survival was as much about courage as caution, and sometimes courage had to overcome panic, even in the face of overwhelming odds. At night, we huddled around small fires, exhausted and silent, but even in the quiet, the Mississippi reminded us it was always awake. From somewhere upriver, I could hear the faint groan of its current reversing, carrying with it logs, barrels, and the occasional broken flatboat. Its voice was low, menacing, and constant. Some whispered that it was punishing us for trespassing. Others said it was cleansing the land. I didn't know what to believe. I only knew we had to respect it, or we would be swept away. Amidst the fear and madness, small miracles occurred. One morning, I discovered a cluster of wild onions and tubers along a raised patch of earth. It was barely enough to supplement our meager rations, but it gave the survivors renewed energy and a reason to continue. Another day, I managed to construct a simple raft using driftwood and rope, allowing us to cross a particularly treacherous section of the river without being swept away. These small victories became lifelines, proof that even in the worst circumstances, ingenuity and determination could keep us alive. But the mental toll was relentless. I could see it in the eyes of others, the vacant stare of a man who had lost his family, the trembling hands of a woman who had survived only by clinging to a piece of debris, the silence of children who had forgotten what normal sounds were. I forced myself to remain vigilant, not just for physical survival, but to hold the group together. If the mind cracked, the body would follow. Then came the night of the great tremor. I will never forget it. The ground rolled beneath us with a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very air. Trees snapped like twigs, and the river surged backward with incredible force, carrying everything in its path. I grabbed what I could, logs, crates, people, and held tight as the world seemed to dissolve around me. I felt the helplessness that only comes when facing a force beyond human comprehension. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were done. And yet, when the shaking ended, we were alive. Every soul still clinging to life was a miracle. We counted them carefully, whispered thanks into the cold night, and for the first time in weeks, allowed ourselves a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it existed. In that moment, I understood that survival was not merely about enduring nature's wrath. It was about finding the strength to act, to help others, and to refuse despair, even when the world had turned against us. As I sat on a piece of driftwood, watching the backward-flowing river reflect the pale moonlight, I realized something profound. The Mississippi had shown us the raw power of the earth. but it had also revealed our own resilience. Fear was constant, but courage, ingenuity, and human connection were stronger. If we could endure this, perhaps we could endure anything.
By the 7th week, the Mississippi's backward flow had reached its terrifying peak. What had once been a predictable river, carrying boats southward toward the Gulf, was now a churning, chaotic artery moving against all reason. The water surged through lowlands that had never flooded before, carving new channels, swallowing forests, and turning familiar landmarks into strange, treacherous illusions. I began to understand that the river was no longer simply an obstacle. It was a force that defined the shape of our survival. Our makeshift camp on high ground had become a small island in a sea of mud and water. Each day, the survivors would check the river, noting changes in the current and floating debris. Even minor variations could mean life or death. A subtle rise might inundate our camp, while a swift surge could sweep away anyone venturing too close. The river taught us vigilance, and mistakes were punished without mercy. One morning, I noticed a massive log jam stretching for hundreds of yards upstream. Entire trees, uprooted from distant banks, had collided in a twisted barricade of wood. The water pooled behind it, rising dangerously. I realized that if it gave way, it would send a wall of water racing downstream toward us. I called the survivors together and instructed them to move supplies and children to higher ground. Some resisted, fearing the effort would provoke the river, but I convinced them that inaction would be far deadlier. We worked together, dragging crates, barrels, and people up the muddy slopes. The river roared as if mocking our efforts, but we persevered. When the logjam finally shifted, it sent a surge of water toward us, powerful enough to knock several survivors off their feet. We clung to anything solid, trees, debris, each other, until the wave passed. Some of the younger men were terrified, faces pale, voices trembling. I reminded them that we had survived worse, and that courage, even in small doses, could save lives. The river's backward flow created strange phenomena. At times, it appeared to rise like a wall, surging inland with immense pressure before retreating just as quickly. Entire fields vanished underwater, leaving no trace of crops, homes, or fences. I saw horses carried away, clinging desperately to floating logs, and men struggling to rescue them. We learned to read the subtle signs, the hum of the water, the color of the mud, the direction of debris. The Mississippi had its own language, and survival required fluency. Food and water were still scarce. We had found a small cache of dried beans lodged in the branches of a partially submerged tree, a miracle of fortune in a world otherwise consumed by chaos. Meals were meager but sacred. Each portion was carefully divided, and everyone knew that squandering even a single bite could be fatal. We foraged constantly, gathering tubers, wild greens, and any trapped fish we could catch in backwater pools created by the river's reversal. Every success was a lifeline, every failure a lesson. Mental strain was relentless. Sleep came in short, anxious bursts. Each tremor, each unexpected surge of the river jolted us awake. Children cried in their sleep, haunted by dreams of being swept away. Adults muttered prayers or wandered aimlessly, staring into the water as if it held answers we could not comprehend.
I forced myself to remain alert, keeping a mental tally of every person, every resource, every potential danger. Leadership was not an honor, it was a responsibility that weighed heavily on my shoulders. By the 7th week, we began to see signs of resilience. Survivors learned to construct small channels and dikes to divert water from their temporary shelters. Makeshift bridges allowed safe passage across treacherous sections. Small victories, finding a crate of supplies, constructing a raft, rescuing a trapped animal, became vital morale boosters. The river's backward flow remained unpredictable, but we adapted, learning not to fight it directly, but to bend to its rhythms. Late one evening, I stood on a piece of driftwood, looking down the twisted, churning river. The backward current reflected the moonlight like a silver snake, moving inexorably against the land's original path. I realized that we had survived not because the river had spared us, but because we had learned its lessons. Each surge, each flood, each aftershock had forced us to adapt, to trust each other, and to find strength we didn't know we possessed. The Mississippi had turned our world upside down, but in its chaos we had found something essential, the will to endure. And with that, I allowed myself the smallest measure of hope that even in a land ruled by disaster, we might yet see another sunrise.
By the 8th week, the Mississippi had become both a teacher and a tyrant. Its backward flow, while still dangerous, had slowed slightly, offering brief moments of calm. But the land remained fractured and unpredictable. Every tremor reminded us that nature's fury was far from spent. Our small group of survivors had become a tightly knit unit, each person relying on the other not only for safety, but for the fragile thread of sanity that had carried us this far. Food was now at its most critical point. What little we had scavenged was nearly gone, and the river had claimed many caches. We foraged constantly, traveling through mud and debris, sometimes risking the river's unpredictable currents to reach small patches of wild onions, tubers, or stranded fish. Each successful outing was a triumph, each failure a brutal lesson in humility. One morning, I found a barrel of salted pork lodged against a tree. It had floated miles, carried north by the river's unnatural flow. The survivors erupted in quiet celebration. Even this small bounty renewed their courage. Water, however, was a constant threat. Most of the river's surface was too muddy or turbulent to drink safely. We relied on rainwater collected in hollowed logs or containers, and on occasional clear springs we discovered by exploring the fractured land. It was painstaking work, but life depended on it. Mental strain was even greater than before. Children woke screaming from nightmares of drowning or being swept away by the river. Adults whispered prayers and stories, trying to mask fear with ritual. Some men began to break under the pressure, wandering alone or muttering incoherently about the river's anger. I became not just a guide, but a counselor, a watchful guardian, trying to hold the fragile group together. Leadership in these circumstances was not a choice. It was the difference between survival and death. During the day, we scouted further upriver, seeking safer grounds and more food sources. The backward flow was strongest in certain channels, creating whirlpools and sudden surges. I learned to read the subtle signs, the way floating debris shifted, the color of the water, the wind brushing against it. These cues became vital. One misstep could send someone tumbling into the mud or swept along with the river, never to be seen again.
One evening, after a long day of scavenging, I sat by the river's edge, exhausted. The moon reflected on the sluggishly backward water, and for the first time in weeks, I noticed a subtle change. The current seemed less insistent, more hesitant. It no longer pulled debris with the same relentless force. The river had begun, ever so slightly, to return to its natural course. My heart lifted with cautious hope. Could it be that the worst was finally over? Even as hope returned, we did not let our guard down. The ground remained treacherous. Fissures could open without warning. Trees could collapse, and aftershocks continued, though they were less violent than before. Still, the survivors worked tirelessly, reinforcing their camp, collecting supplies, and planning for when the river would fully resume its normal flow. Adaptation had become instinct. The people around me had changed profoundly. The terror, hunger, and uncertainty had forged resilience and unity. We had learned to cooperate in ways unimaginable before the disaster. Every task, hauling water, foraging for food, scouting flooded terrain, required collective effort. Small victories were celebrated, and each one strengthened the bonds between us. We were no longer merely surviving individually. Survival had become a communal endeavor. That night, as we gathered around a small fire, I allowed myself to speak to the group. I reminded them of what we had endured, the backward river, the trembling earth, the hunger, the fear, and I spoke of what we had learned. Even in this broken, twisted land, we had found strength, courage, and resourcefulness. Each person, each act of bravery had contributed to our continued survival. And with the river beginning to return to its rightful course, perhaps the nightmare was finally easing. I lay down that night, wrapped in a tattered blanket, listening to the gentle gurgle of water beginning to move southward again. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The river, once a monstrous enemy, had shown us the power of adaptation, patience, and resilience. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself the faintest trace of optimism. The Mississippi might yet flow as it had for centuries, and we might endure to witness it.
By the 9th week, the Mississippi was finally showing signs of mercy. The once monstrous backward flow had slowed almost imperceptibly, then gradually, in subtle increments, began to follow its ancient southward path once more. For the survivors, the change was nothing short of miraculous, a tangible sign that the worst might finally be behind us. The land, however, remained scarred and unrecognizable. Flooded fields, collapsed riverbanks, and fissures that had swallowed homes and livestock were everywhere. Forests had been stripped of trees, and islands had vanished, replaced with mud-choked channels. The Mississippi now moved with purpose, yet each bend, each ripple reminded us of the chaos it had wrought. It was a river transformed, and we were survivors marked by the ordeal. We moved cautiously. The lessons of the past 8 weeks had taught us that the river could not be trusted blindly. I led groups upriver and downriver, salvaging supplies trapped in mud or lodged in debris. Every recovered barrel, every trapped fish, every patch of wild roots brought sustenance, and more importantly, morale. The survivors had become nimble, resourceful, and disciplined. The shared experience of enduring a living catastrophe had forged a community stronger than any I had known. I remember one morning walking along a channel that had been submerged for weeks, spotting a tree trapped in the mud, its roots exposed and stripped of soil.
Nearby, a flatboat, half buried, had lodged against its trunk. It contained what remained of some provisions: flour, dried beans, a few rusted tools. I called the others, and together we hauled it to safety, carefully rationing the contents. Every small victory was celebrated, not with frivolity, but with quiet reverence. We had earned our survival, one painstaking effort at a time. The children were beginning to smile again, though cautiously. Their laughter was hesitant, fragile, but it reminded us all of what we had endured and what we had protected. The women, once silent with fear, now spoke to one another, sharing plans and strategies for rebuilding. Men checked the river daily, still wary, still respectful, but with eyes that gleamed with the first signs of hope. I often paused to watch the Mississippi. Its waters, flowing south as they had for centuries, now carried the debris of a changed land, uprooted trees, splintered cabins, and the occasional barrel bobbing lazily downstream. The river had been cruel, unforgiving, and unnatural in its backward surge, but it had also taught us resilience. We had adapted to its whims, endured its fury, and survived. And now, seeing it flow properly again, I felt a profound sense of closure, a reassurance that nature, even after lashing out, could return to a semblance of order. One evening, I guided a small group along the riverbank to inspect damage. The channel was deep, the banks unstable, yet the water moved predictably. A herd of deer cautiously emerged from the forest, drinking from the river's edge. Birds returned to the trees. Even the air felt less oppressive, freer somehow, as if the land was exhaling after weeks of strain. For the first time in 2 months, it felt like life could resume. We began planning for reconstruction, for the slow task of reclaiming our homes and livelihoods. Every patch of dry land became valuable, every tree or building that remained a resource. The Mississippi had reminded us of our fragility, but it had also reinforced the power of determination, collaboration, and courage. We were survivors, not just by luck, but by effort, ingenuity, and perseverance. That night, as the sun set over the newly flowing river, I stood alone on a patch of high ground. The water reflected amber and gold, swirling gently in its rightful direction. The river had returned, yes, but we were changed. Our understanding of its power, our respect for its force, and our memory of its backward fury would remain with us forever. In that reflection, I saw both devastation and hope, fear and resilience, despair and triumph. The Mississippi had flowed backward, and we had endured. And as it returned to its natural path, I knew we would continue, forever altered, but alive. By the 10th week, the Mississippi River had returned fully to its natural course, flowing southward as it had for centuries. The backward fury, the surging waters, the terrifying chaos, all of it had passed. Yet the land remained irrevocably changed, and so had we. Survivors emerged from their makeshift camps, tired, scarred, and wary, yet alive, a testament to human endurance in the face of incomprehensible disaster. We began the painstaking work of reclaiming what remained. Houses were leveled, fences torn apart, and farmland swallowed by mud. Yet we did not despair.
Each salvaged plank, each recovered barrel, each patch of cleared earth became a victory. Children helped gather firewood, while adults repaired boats, dug channels to drain stagnant water, and cleared debris from what would once again be fields. Survival had taught us not only resilience, but patience and collaboration. The Mississippi had been a teacher in its fury. Its backward surge had destroyed our assumptions, uprooted our lives, and forced us to adapt with ingenuity. Now, as it flowed properly again, it seemed to offer a quiet blessing. The river no longer roared with menace, yet it remained a reminder of its might, a scarred but enduring lifeline, carrying us and our world forward. I often walked along the banks, observing how the land was slowly healing. Trees had been stripped of branches, yet saplings sprouted among the mud and debris. Birds returned to perch in battered forests. Wildlife emerged cautiously from hiding. Even the river itself seemed calmer, aware, perhaps, that the worst had passed. In these quiet moments, I reflected on what survival had truly meant. It had been more than enduring tremors, floods, and hunger. It had been learning to see clearly in chaos, to trust our instincts, and to rely on one another. By now, the survivors had formed routines. Groups fanned out to gather food and rebuild shelters. Some reconstructed rudimentary levees to protect from future flooding. Others repaired flatboats to resume trade along the river. There was laughter again, soft at first, fragile, but growing stronger with each passing day. Children played with sticks and scraps of cloth, pretending the river was a calm stream instead of a monster that had turned their world upside down. I found myself teaching lessons I had learned the hard way. Respect the river, I would say, echoing my own experience. Watch the land, observe the signs, don't fight nature, work with it. The survivors listened, not just out of necessity, but because every word came from someone who had walked the edge of disaster and lived. My knowledge of the river, once a simple skill for trade, had become a lifeline for the entire group. Even as life slowly resumed, we carried memories of the terror. Nights remained sleepless for some, haunted by the backward surge and the cracks that had swallowed neighbors and livestock. We shared stories, not to dwell in fear, but to honor those who were lost, and to remind ourselves of the courage it took to endure. The Mississippi had changed everything, but it had also revealed what we were capable of when faced with forces beyond comprehension. Months would pass before the land fully stabilized. Flooded fields would dry, fissures would settle, and new channels would form as the river reclaimed its rightful path. The town of New Madrid would be rebuilt, brick by brick and plank by plank. Yet none of us would ever forget the weeks when the Mississippi ran backward, when the earth trembled beneath us, and when survival demanded everything we had. Standing on a high bank one morning, watching the river flow southward in gentle, determined currents, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had endured terror, hunger, and fear unimaginable before that fateful December. We had faced nature at its most unforgiving and lived to see calm restored. The Mississippi had tested us, reshaped us, and ultimately reminded us of the fragile, precious gift of life. As the sun rose, gilding the river with golden light, I knew we would rebuild. The land was wounded, yes, but alive. So were we, and together we would continue. Forever aware of the river's power, yet stronger for having survived it. In the silence of that morning, I understood the final truth of those weeks. The Mississippi could run backward, the earth could tremble, but the human spirit, guided by courage, ingenuity, and unity, could endure anything.